Chapter 4. The Second Sowing. It is no part of mine to narrate the adventures of John Nicholson, which were many, but simply his more momentous misadventures, which were more than he desired, and, by human standards, more than he deserved, how he reached California, how he was rooked and robbed and beaten and starved, how he was at last taken up by charitable folk, restored to some degree of self-complacency, and installed as a clerk in a bank in San Francisco. It would take too long to tell, nor in these episodes were there any marks of the peculiar Nicholsonic destiny, for they were just such matters as befell some thousands of other young adventurers in the same days and places. But once posted in the bank, he fell for a time into a high degree of good fortune, which, as it was only a longer way about a fresh disaster, it behooves me to explain. It was his luck to meet a young man in what is technically called a dive, and thanks to his monthly wages, to extricate this new acquaintance from a position of present disgrace and possible danger in the future. This young man was the nephew of one of the Nob Hill magnates who run the San Francisco Stock Exchange, much as more humble adventurers, in the corner of some public park at home, may be seen to perform the simple artifice of pea and thimble for their own profit, that is to say, and the discouragement of public gambling. It was thus in his power, and as he was of grateful temper, it was among the things that he desired to put John in the way of growing rich, and thus without thought or industry, or so much as even understanding the game at which he played, but by simply buying and selling what he was told to buy and sell. The plaything of fortune was presently at the head of between £11,000 and £12,000, or, as he reckoned it, of upward of $60,000. How he had come to deserve this wealth, any more than how he had formerly earned disgrace at home, was a problem beyond the reach of his philosophy. It was true that he had been industrious at the bank, but no more so than the cashier, who had 7 small children and was visibly sinking in decline. Nor was the step which had determined his advance a visit to a dive with a month's wages in his pocket, an act of such transcendent virtue, or even wisdom, as to seem to merit the favor of the gods. From some sense of this, and of the dizzy seesaw heaven high, held deep on which men sit clutching, or perhaps fearing that the sources of his fortune might be insidiously traced to some root in the field of petty cash, he stuck to his work, said not a word of his new circumstances, and kept his account with a bank in a different quarter of the town. The concealment, innocent as it seems, was the first step in the second tragicomedy of John's existence. Meanwhile, he had never written home, whether from diffidence or shame, or a touch of anger, or mere procrastination, or because, as we have seen, he had no skill in literary arts, or because, as I am sometimes tempted to suppose, there is a law in human nature that prevents young men, not otherwise beasts, from the performance of this simple act of piety. Months and years had gone by, and John had never written. The habit of not writing, indeed, was already fixed before he had begun to come into his fortune, and it was only the difficulty of breaking this long silence that withheld him from an instant restitution of the money he had stolen, or as he preferred to call it, borrowed. In vain he sat before paper, attending on inspiration. That heavenly nymph, beyond suggesting the words "my dear father," remained obstinately silent, and presently John would crumple up the sheet and decide, as soon as he had a good chance, to carry the money home in person. And this delay, which is indefensible, was his second step into the snares of fortune. 10 years had passed, and John was drawing near to 30. He had kept the promise of his boyhood, and was now of a lusty frame, verging toward corpulence, good features, good eyes, a genial manner, a ready laugh, a long pair of sandy whiskers, a dash of an American accent, a close familiarity with the great American joke, and a certain likeness to a R.I.L.P. N. Gay, who shall remain nameless for me, made up the man's externals as he could be viewed in society. Inwardly, in spite of his gross body and highly masculine whiskers, he was more like a maiden lady than a man of 29. It chanced one day, as he was strolling down Market Street on the eve of his fortnight's holiday, that his eye was caught by certain railway bills, and in very idleness of mind he calculated that he might be home for Christmas if he started on the morrow. The fancy thrilled him with desire, and in one moment he decided he would go. There was much to be done, his portmanteau to be packed, a credit to be got from the bank where he was a wealthy customer, and certain offices to be transacted for that other bank in which he was an humble clerk. And it chanced, in conformity with human nature, that out of all this business it was the last that came to be neglected. Night found him, not only equipped with money of his own, but once more, as on that former occasion, saddled with a considerable sum of other people's. Now it chanced there lived in the same boarding house a fellow clerk of his, an honest fellow, with what is called a weakness for drink, though it might, in this case, have been called a strength, for the victim had been drunk for weeks together without the briefest intermission. To this unfortunate John entrusted a letter with an enclosure of bonds, addressed to the bank manager. Even as he did so, he thought he perceived a certain haziness of eye and speech in his trustee, but he was too hopeful to be stayed, silenced the voice of warning in his bosom, and with one and the same gesture committed the money to the clerk, and himself into the hands of destiny. I dwell, even at the risk of tedium, on John's Misadentures, his case being so perplexing to the moralist. But we have done with them now. The roll is closed. The reader has the worst of our poor hero, and I leave him to judge for himself whether he or John has been the less deserving. Henceforth we have to follow the spectacle of a man who was a mere whip-top for calamity, on whose unmerited misadventures not even the humorist can look without pity, and not even the philosopher without alarm. That same night the clerk entered upon a bout of drunkenness so consistent as to surprise even his intimate acquaintance. He was speedily ejected from the boarding house, deposited his portmanteau with a perfect stranger, who did not even catch his name, wandered he knew not where, and was at last hove to, all standing, in a hospital at Sacramento. There, under the impenetrable alias of the number of his bed, the crapulous being lay for some more days unconscious of all things, and of one thing in particular, that the police were after him. 2 months had come and gone before the convalescent in the Sacramento hospital was identified with Kirkman, the absconding San Francisco clerk. Even then, there must elapse nearly a fortnight more till the perfect stranger could be hunted up, the portmanteau recovered, and John's letter carried at length to its destination, the seal still unbroken, the enclosure still intact. Meanwhile, John had gone upon his holidays without a word, which was irregular, and there had disappeared with him a certain sum of money, which was out of all bounds of palliation. But he was known to be careless, and believed to be honest. The manager besides had a regard for him, and little was said, although something was no doubt thought, until the fortnight was finally at an end, and the time had come for John to reappear. Then, indeed, the affair began to look black, and when inquiries were made, and the penniless clerk was found to have amassed thousands of dollars, and kept them secretly in a rival establishment, the stoutest of his friends abandoned him, the books were overhauled for traces of ancient and artful fraud, and though none were found, there still prevailed a general impression of loss. The telegraph was set in motion, and the correspondent of the bank in Edinburgh, for which place it was understood that John had armed himself with extensive credits, was warned to communicate with the police. Now this correspondent was a friend of Mr. Nicholson's. He was well acquainted with the tale of John's calamitous disappearance from Edinburgh, and putting one thing with another, hasted with the first word of this scandal, not to the police but to his friend. The old gentleman had long regarded his son as one dead. John's place had been taken. The memory of his faults had already fallen to be one of those old aches, which awaken again indeed upon occasion, but which we can always vanquish by an effort of the will. And to have the long lost resuscitated in a fresh disgrace was doubly bitter. "Mason," said the old man, "this must be hushed up, if possible. If I give you a cheque for this sum, about which they are certain, could you take it on yourself to let the matter rest?" "I will," said Mason. "I will take the risk of it." "You understand," resumed Mr. Nicholson, speaking precisely but with ashen lips, "I do this for my family, not for that unhappy young man. If it should turn out that these suspicions are correct, and he has embezzled large sums, he must lie on his bed as he has made it." And then looking up at Mason with a nod, and one of his strange smiles, "Goodbye," said he, and Mason, perceiving the case to be too grave for consolation, took himself off, and blessed God on his way home that he was childless. Chapter 5. The Prodigal's Return. By a little afternoon on the eve of Christmas, John had left his portmanteau in the cloakroom, and stepped forth into Prince's Street, with a wonderful expansion of the soul, such as men enjoy on the completion of long-nourished schemes. He was at home again, incognito and rich. Presently he could enter his father's house by means of the pass key, which he had piously preserved through all his wanderings. He would throw down the borrowed money. There would be a reconciliation, the details of which he frequently arranged, and he saw himself, during the next month, made welcome in many stately houses at many frigid dinner parties, taking his share in the conversation with the freedom of the man and the traveller, and laying down the law upon finance with the authority of the successful investor. But this programme was not to be begun before evening, not till just before dinner, indeed, at which meal the reassembled family were to sit rose-eat, and the best wine, the modern fatted calf, should flow for the prodigal's return. Meanwhile he walked familiar streets, merry reminiscences crowding round him, sad ones also, both with the same surprising pathos. The keen frosty air, the low, rosy, wintry sun, the castle, hailing him like an old acquaintance, the names of friends on door plates, the sight of friends whom he seemed to recognize, and whom he eagerly avoided, in the streets, the pleasant chant of the North Country accent, the dome of St. George's reminding him of his last penitential moments in the lane, and of that King of Glory whose name had echoed ever since in the saddest corner of his memory, and the gutters where he had learned to slide, and the shop where he had bought his skates, and the stones on which he had trod, and the railings in which he had rattled his clackan as he went to school, and all those 1,001 nameless particulars, which the eye sees without noting, which the memory keeps indeed yet without knowing, and which, taken one with another, build up for us the aspect of the place that we call home. All these besieged him, as he went with both delight and sadness. His first visit was for Houston, who had a house on Regent Terrace. kept for him in old days by an aunt. The door was opened to his surprise upon the chain, and a voice asked him from within what he wanted. "I want Mr. Houston, Mr. Allen Houston," said he. "And who are ye?" said the voice. "This is most extraordinary," thought John, and then aloud he told his name. "No, young Mr. John," cried the voice, with a sudden increase of Scotch accent, testifying to a friendlier feeling. "The very same," said John. And the old butler removed his defences, remarking only, "I thought ye were that man," but his master was not there. He was staying, it appeared, at the house in Murrayfield. And though the butler would have been glad enough to have taken his place and given all the news of the family, John, struck with a little chill, was eager to be gone. Only the door was scarce closed again, before he regretted that he had not asked about that man. He was to pay no more visits till he had seen his father and made all well at home. Allen had been the only possible exception, and John had not time to go as far as Murrayfield. But here he was on Regent Terrace. There was nothing to prevent him going round the end of the hill and looking from without on the Mackenzies' house. As he went, he reflected that Flora must now be a woman of near his own age, and it was within the bounds of possibility that she was married. But this dishonourable doubt he damned down. There was the house, sure enough, but the door was of another colour, and what was this 2-door plates? He drew nearer. The top one bore, with dignified simplicity, the words Mr. Proudfoot. The lower one was more explicit, and informed the passer-by that here was likewise the abode of Mr. J. A. Dunlop Proudfoot, advocate. The Proudfoots must be rich, for no advocate could look to have much business in so remote a quarter, and John hated them for their wealth and for their name, and for the sake of the house they desecrated with their presence. He remembered a Proudfoot he had seen at school, not known, a little, whey-faced urchin, the despicable member of some lower class. Could it be this abortion that had climbed to be an advocate, and now lived in the birthplace of Flora and the home of John's tenderest memories? The chill that had first seized upon him when he heard of Houston's absence deepened and struck inward. For a moment, as he stood under the doors of that estranged house, and looked east and west along the solitary pavement of the Royal Terrace, where not a cat was stirring, the sense of solitude and desolation took him by the throat, and he wished himself in San Francisco. And then the figure he made, with his decent portliness, his whiskers, the money in his purse, the excellent cigar that he now lighted, recurred to his mind in consolatory comparison with that of a certain Madden lad, who, on a certain spring Sunday 10 years before, and in an hour of church-time silence, had stolen from that city by the Glasgow road. In the face of these changes, it were impious to doubt fortune's kindness. All would be well yet. The Mackenzies would be found, Flora younger and lovelier and kinder than before. Allen would be found, and would have so nicely discriminated his behaviour as to have grown, on the one hand, into a valued friend of Mr. Nicholson's, and to have remained, upon the other, of that exact shade of joviality which John desired in his companions. And so, once more John fell to work discounting the delightful future, his first appearance in the family pew, his first visit to his Uncle Gregg, who thought himself so great a financier, and on whose purblind Edinburgh eyes John was to let in the dazzling daylight of the West, and the details in general of that unrivalled transformation scene, in which he was to display to all Edinburgh a portly and successful gentleman in the shoes of the derided fugitive. The time began to draw near when his father would have returned from the office, and it would be the prodigal's cue to enter. He strolled westward by Albany Street, facing the sunset embers, pleased, he knew not why, to move in that cold air and indigo twilight, starred with street lamps. But there was one more disenchantment waiting him by the way. At the corner of Pitt Street he paused to light a fresh cigar. The vesta threw, as he did so, a strong light upon his features, and a man of about his own age stopped at sight of it. "I think your name must be Nicholson," said the stranger. It was too late to avoid recognition, and besides, as John was now actually on the way home, it hardly mattered, and he gave way to the impulse of his nature. "Great Scott," he cried. Beatson and shook hands with warmth. It scarce seemed he was repaid in kind. "So you're home again," said Beatson. "Where have you been all this long time?" "In the States," said John, "California. I've made my pile, though, and it suddenly struck me it would be a noble scheme to come home for Christmas." "I see," said Beatson. "Well, I hope we'll see something of you now you're here." "Oh, I guess so," said John, a little frozen. "Well, Tata," concluded Beatson, and he shook hands again and went. This was a cruel first experience. It was idle to blink facts. He was John home again, and old Beatson did not care a rush. He recalled old Beatson in the past, that merry and affectionate lad, and their joint adventures and mishaps, the window they had broken with a catapult in India Place, the escalade of the Castle Rock, and many another inestimable bond of friendship, and his hurt surprise grew deeper. Well, after all, it was only on a man's own family that he could count. Blood was thicker than water, he remembered, and the net result of this encounter was to bring him to the doorstep of his father's house, with tenderer and softer feelings. The night had come. The fanlight over the door shone bright, the 2 windows of the dining room where the cloth was being laid, and the 3 windows of the drawing room where Maria would be waiting dinner, glowed softly through yellow blinds. It was like a vision of the past. All this time of his absence life had gone forward with an equal foot, and the fires and the gas had been lighted, and the meal spread at the accustomed hours. At the accustomed hour, too, the bell had sounded thrice to call the family to worship, and at the thought, a pang of regret for his demerit seized him. He remembered the things that were good, and that he had neglected, and the things that were evil, and that he had loved, and it was with a prayer upon his lips that he mounted the steps and thrust the key into the keyhole. He stepped into the lighted hall, shut the door softly behind him, and stood there fixed in wonder. No surprise of strangeness could equal the surprise of that complete familiarity. There was the bust of Chalmers near the stair railings, there was the clothes brush in the accustomed place, and there, on the hat stand, hung hats and coats that must surely be the same as he remembered. 10 years dropped from his life, as a pin may slip between the fingers, and the ocean and the mountains, and the mines and crowded marts and mingled races of San Francisco, and his own fortune and his own disgrace became for that one moment the figures of a dream that was over. He took off his hat and moved mechanically toward the stand, and there he found a small change that was a great one to him. The pin that had been his from boyhood, where he had flung his Balmoral when he loitered home from the academy, and his first hat when he came briskly back from college or the office his pin was occupied. They might have at least respected my pin, he thought, and he was moved as by a slight, and began at once to recollect that he was here an interloper, in a strange house, which he had entered almost by a burglary, and where at any moment he might be scandalously challenged. He moved at once, his hat still in his hand, to the door of his father's room, opened it, and entered. Mr. Nicholson sat in the same place and posture as on that last Sunday morning, only he was older, and greyer, and sterner. And as he now glanced up and caught the eye of his son, a strange commotion and a dark flush sprung into his face. "Father," said John, steadily and even cheerfully, for this was a moment against which he was long ago prepared, "Father, here I am, and here is the money that I took from you. I have come back to ask your forgiveness, and to stay Christmas with you and the children." "Keep your money," said the father, "and go." "Father," cried John, "for God's sake don't receive me this way. I've come for—" "Understand me," interrupted Mr. Nicholson. "You are no son of mine, and in the sight of God I wash my hands of you. One last thing I will tell you. One warning I will give you. All is discovered, and you are being hunted for your crimes. If you are still at large, it is thanks to me. But I have done all that I mean to do, and from this time forth I would not raise one finger, not one finger, to save you from the gallows." And now, with a low voice of absolute authority, and a single weighty gesture of the finger, "And now go." Chapter 6. The House 18 Murrayfield. How John passed the evening, in what windy confusion of mind, in what squalls of anger and lulls of sick collapse, in what pacing of streets and plunging into public houses, it would profit little to relate. His misery, if it were not progressive, yet tended in no way to diminish, for in proportion as grief and indignation abated, fear began to take their place. At first his father's menacing words lay by in some safe drawer of memory, biding their hour. At first John was all thwarted affection and blighted hope. Next bludgeoned vanity raised its head again, with 20 mortal gashes, and the father was disowned even as he had disowned the son. What was this regular course of life? That John should have admired it. What were these clockwork virtues from which love was absent? Kindness was the test, kindness the aim and soul, and judged by such a standard, the discarded prodigal, now rapidly drowning his sorrows and his reason in successive drams, was a creature of a lovelier morality than his self-righteous father. Yes, he was the better man, he felt it, glowed with the consciousness. And entering a public house at the corner of Howard Place, whither he had somehow wandered, he pledged his own virtues in a glass, perhaps the fourth since his dismissal. Of that he knew nothing, keeping no account of what he did or where he went, and in the general crashing hurry of his nerves, unconscious of the approach of intoxication. Indeed, it is a question whether he were really growing intoxicated, or whether at first the spirits did not even sober him, for it was even as he drained this last glass that his father's ambiguous and menacing words, popping from their hiding place in memory, startled him like a hand laid upon his shoulder. Crimes, hunted, the gallows. They were ugly words in the ears of an innocent man, perhaps all the uglier, for if some judicial error were in act against him, who should set a limit to its grossness, or to how far it might be pushed? Not John, indeed. He was no believer in the powers of innocence, his cursed experience pointing in quite other ways, and his fears, once wakened, grew with every hour and hunted him about the city streets. It was perhaps nearly 9 at night, he had eaten nothing since lunch, he had drunk a good deal, and he was exhausted by emotion, when the thought of Houston came into his head. He turned not merely to the man as a friend, but to his house as a place of refuge. The danger that threatened him was still so vague that he knew neither what to fear nor where he might expect it. But this much at least seemed undeniable, that a private house was safer than a public inn. Moved by these counsels, he turned at once to the Caledonian station, passed not without alarm into the bright lights of the approach, redeemed his portmanteau from the cloakroom, and was soon whirling in a cab along the Glasgow road, the change of movement and position, the sight of the lamps twinkling to the rear, and the smell of damp and mould and rotten straw which clung about the vehicle, wrought in him strange alternations of lucidity and mortal giddiness. I have been drinking, he discovered. I must go straight to bed and sleep, and he thanked heaven for the drowsiness that came upon his mind in waves. From one of these spells he was wakened by the stoppage of the cab, and getting down found himself in quite a country road, the last lamp of the suburb shining some way below, and the high walls of a garden rising before him in the dark. The lodge, as the place was named, stood, indeed, very solitary. To the south it adjoined another house, but standing in so large a garden as to be well out of cry. On all other sides, open fields stretched upward to the woods of Corstorphine Hill, or backward to the dells of Ravelston, or downward toward the valley of the Leith. The effect of seclusion was aided by the great height of the garden walls, which were indeed conventual and, as John had tested in former days, defied the climbing schoolboy. The lamp of the cab threw a gleam upon the door, and the not brilliant handle of the bell. "Shall I ring for ye?" said the cabman, who had descended from his perch, and was slapping his chest, for the night was bitter. "I wish you would," said John, putting his hand to his brow in one of his accesses of giddiness. The man pulled at the handle, and the clanking of the bell replied from further in the garden. Twice and thrice he did it, with sufficient intervals. In the great frosty silence of the night the sounds fell sharp and small. "Does he expect ye?" asked the driver, with that manner of familiar interest that well became his port-wine face. And when John had told him no, "Well, then," said the cabman, "if you'll take my advice of it, we'll just gang back. And that's disinterested, mind ye, for my stables are in the Glasgow road." "The servants must hear," said John. "Hout," said the driver. "He keeps no servants here, man. They're in the townhouse. I drive 'em often. It's just a kind of a hermitage, this." "Give me the bell," said John, and he plucked at it like a man desperate. The clamour had not yet subsided before they heard steps upon the gravel, and a voice of singular nervous irritability cried to them through the door, "Who are you, and what do you want?" "Alan," said John. "It's me, it's Fatty John, you know. I'm just come home, and I've come to stay with you." There was no reply for a moment, and then the door was opened. "Get the portmanteau down," said John to the driver. "Do nothing of the kind," said Alan, and then to John, "Come in here a moment. I want to speak to you." John entered the garden, and the door was closed behind him. A candle stood on the gravel walk, winking a little in the draughts. It threw in constant sparkles on the clumped holly, struck the light and darkness to and fro like a veil on Alan's features, and sent his shadow hovering behind him. All beyond was inscrutable, and John's dizzy brain rocked with the shadow. Yet even so, it struck him that Alan was pale, and his voice, when he spoke, unnatural. "What brings you here tonight?" he began. "I don't want, God knows, to seem unfriendly, but I cannot take you in, Nicholson. I cannot do it." "Alan," said John, "you've just got to. You don't know the mess I'm in. The governor's turned me out, and I daren't show my face in an inn, because they're down on me for murder or something." "For what?" cried Alan, starting. "Murder, I believe," says John. "Murder," repeated Alan, and passed his hand over his eyes. "What was that you were saying?" he asked again. "That they were down on me," said John. "The first am accused of murder, by what I can make out, and I've really had a dreadful day of it, Alan. And I can't sleep on the roadside on a night like this, at least, not with a portmanteau," he pleaded. "Hush," said Alan, with his head on one side. "And then did you hear nothing?" he asked. "No," said John, thrilling, he knew not why, with communicated terror. "No, I heard nothing." "Why?" And then, as there was no answer, he reverted to his pleading. "But I say, Alan, you've just got to take me in. I'll go right away to bed if you have anything to do. I seem to have been drinking. I was that knocked over. I wouldn't turn you away, Alan, if you were down on your luck." "No," returned Alan, "neither will you then. Come and let's get your portmanteau." The cabman was paid, and drove off down the long, lamp-lighted hill, and the two friends stood on the sidewalk beside the portmanteau till the last rumble of the wheels had died in silence. It seemed to John as though Alan attached importance to this departure of the cab, and John, who was in no state to criticize, shared profoundly in the feeling. When the stillness was once more perfect, Alan shouldered the portmanteau, carried it in, and shut and locked the garden door, and then, once more, abstraction seemed to fall upon him, and he stood with his hand on the key, until the cold began to nibble at John's fingers. "Why are we standing here?" asked John. Said Alan, blankly. "Why, man, you don't seem yourself," said the other. "No, I'm not myself," said Alan, and he sat down on the portmanteau and put his face in his hands. John stood beside him, swaying a little, and looking about him at the swaying shadows, the flitting sparkles, and the steady stars overhead, until the windless cold began to touch him through his clothes on the bare skin. Even in his bemused intelligence, wonder began to awake. "I say, let's come on to the house," he said at last. "Yes, "Let's come on to the house," repeated Alan. And he rose at once, reshouldered the portmanteau, and taking the candle in his other hand, moved forward to the lodge. This was a long, low building, smothered in creepers. And now, except for some chinks of light between the dining room shutters, it was plunged in darkness and silence. In the hall, Alan lighted another candle, gave it to John, and opened the door of a bedroom. "Here," said he, "go to bed." "Don't mind me, John, you'll be sorry for me when you know." "Wait a bit," returned John. "I've got so cold with all that standing about. Let's go into the dining room a minute. Just one glass to warm me, Alan." On the table in the hall stood a glass, and a bottle with a whiskey label on a tray. It was plain the bottle had been just opened, for the cork and corkscrew lay beside it. "Take that," said Alan, passing John the whiskey, and then with a certain roughness pushed his friend into the bedroom, and closed the door behind him. John stood amazed, then he shook the bottle, and to his further wonder found it partly empty. 3 or 4 glasses were gone. Alan must have uncorked a bottle of whiskey and drank 3 or 4 glasses one after the other, without sitting down, for there was no chair, and that in his own cold lobby on this freezing night. It fully explained his eccentricities, John reflected sagely, as he mixed himself a grog. Poor Alan, he was drunk, and what a dreadful thing was drink, and what a slave to it poor Alan was, to drink in this unsociable, uncomfortable fashion. The man who would drink alone, except for health's sake as John was now doing, was a man utterly lost. He took the grog out, and felt hazier but warmer. It was hard work opening the portmanteau and finding his night things, and before he was undressed, the cold had struck home to him once more. "Well," said he, "just a drop more. There's no sense in getting ill with all this other trouble," and presently dreamless slumber buried him. When John awoke it was day. The low winter sun was already in the heavens, but his watch had stopped, and it was impossible to tell the hour exactly. 10, he guessed it, and made haste to dress, dismal reflections crowding on his mind, but it was less from terror than from regret that he now suffered, and with his regret there were mingled cutting pangs of penitence. There had fallen upon him a blow, cruel indeed, but yet only the punishment of old misdoing, and he had rebelled and plunged into fresh sin. The rod had been used to chasten, and he had bit the chastening fingers. His father was right, John had justified him. John was no guest for decent people's houses, and no fit associate for decent people's children, and had a broader hint been needed, there was the case of his old friend. John was no drunkard, though he could at times exceed, and the picture of Houston drinking neat spirits at his hall table struck him with something like disgust. He hung back from meeting his old friend. He could have wished he had not come to him. And yet, even now, where else was he to turn? These musings occupied him while he dressed, and accompanied him into the lobby of the house. The door stood open on the garden, doubtless. Alan had stepped forth, and John did as he supposed his friend had done. The ground was hard as iron, the frost still rigorous. As he brushed among the hollies, icicles jingled and glittered in their fall, and wherever he went, a volley of eager sparrows followed him. Here were Christmas weather and Christmas morning duly met, to the delight of children. This was the day of reunited families, the day to which he had so long looked forward, thinking to awake in his own bed in Randolph Crescent, reconciled with all men and repeating the footprints of his youth, and here he was alone, pacing the alleys of a wintry garden and filled with penitential thoughts. And that reminded him. Why was he alone? And where was Alan? The thought of the festal morning and the due salutations reawakened his desire for his friend, and he began to call for him by name. As the sound of his voice died away, he was aware of the greatness of the silence that environed him. But for the twittering of the sparrows and the crunching of his own feet upon the frozen snow, the whole windless world of air hung over him entranced, and the stillness weighed upon his mind with a horror of solitude. Still calling at intervals, but now with a moderated voice, he made the hasty circuit of the garden, and finding neither man nor trace of man in all its evergreen coverts, turned at last to the house. About the house the silence seemed to deepen strangely. The door, indeed, stood open as before, but the windows were still shuttered. The chimneys breathed no stain to the bright air. There sounded abroad none of that low stir perhaps audible rather to the ear of the spirit than to the ear of the flesh by which a house announces and betrays its human lodgers. And yet Alan must be there, Alan locked in drunken slumbers, forgetful of the return of day, of the holy season, and of the friend whom he had so coldly received, and was now so churlishly neglecting. John's disgust redoubled at the thought, but hunger was beginning to grow stronger than repulsion, and as a step to breakfast, if nothing else, he must find and arouse this sleeper. He made the circuit of the bedroom quarters. All, until he came to Alan's chamber, were locked from without, and bore the marks of a prolonged disuse. But Alan's was a room in commission, filled with clothes, knickknacks, letters, books, and the conveniences of a solitary man. The fire had been lighted, but it had long ago burned out, and the ashes were stone cold. The bed had been made, but it had not been slept in. Worse and worse, then, Alan must have fallen where he sat, and now sprawled brutishly, no doubt, upon the dining-room floor. The dining-room was a very long apartment, and was reached through a passage, so that John, upon his entrance, brought but little light with him, and must move toward the windows with spread arms, groping and knocking on the furniture. Suddenly he tripped and fell his length over a prostrate body. It was what he had looked for. Yet it shocked him, and he marveled that so rough an impact should not have kicked a groan out of the drunkard. Men had killed themselves ere now in such excesses, a dreary and degraded end that made John shudder. What if Alan were dead? There would be a Christmas Day. By this John had his hand upon the shutters, and flinging them back, beheld once again the blessed face of the day. Even by that light the room had a discomfortable air. The chairs were scattered, and one had been overthrown. The tablecloth, laid as if for dinner, was twitched upon one side, and some of the dishes had fallen to the floor. Behind the table lay the drunkard, still unaroused, only 1 foot visible to John. But now that light was in the room, the worst seemed over. It was a disgusting business, but not more than disgusting, and it was with no great apprehension that John proceeded to make the cirque of the table, his last comparatively tranquil moment for that day. No sooner had he turned the corner, no sooner had his eyes alighted on the body, than he gave a smothered, breathless cry, and fled out of the room and out of the house. It was not Alan who lay there, but a man well up in years, of stern countenance and iron-grey locks, and it was no drunkard, for the body lay in a black pool of blood, and the open eyes stared upon the ceiling. To and fro walked John before the door. The extreme sharpness of the air acted on his nerves like an astringent, and braced them swiftly. Presently, he not relaxing in his disordered walk, the images began to come clearer and stay longer in his fancy, and next the power of thought came back to him, and the horror and danger of his situation rooted him to the ground. He grasped his forehead, and staring on one spot of gravel, pieced together what he knew and what he suspected. Alan had murdered someone, possibly that man against whom the butler chained the door in Regent Terrace, possibly another, someone at least, a human soul, whom it was death to slay and whose blood lay spilled upon the floor. This was the reason of the whiskey drinking in the passage, of his unwillingness to welcome John, of his strange behavior and bewildered words. This was why he had started at, and harped upon the name of murder. This was why he had stood and hearkened, or sat and covered his eyes, in the black night. And now he was gone. Now he had basely fled, and to all his perplexities and dangers John stood heir. Let me think, he said, aloud, impatiently, even pleadingly, as if to some merciless interrupter. In the turmoil of his wits, 1,000 hints and hopes and threats and terrors dinning continuously in his ears, he was like one plunged in the hubbub of a crowd. How was he to remember, he, who had not a thought to spare, that he was himself the author, as well as the theatre, of so much confusion? But in hours of trial the junto of man's nature is dissolved, and anarchy succeeds. It was plain he must stay no longer where he was, for here was a new judicial error in the very making. It was not so plain where he must go, for the old judicial error, vague as a cloud, appeared to fill the habitable world. Whatever it might be, it watched for him, full grown. In Edinburgh it must have had its birth in San Francisco. It stood guard, no doubt, like a dragon, at the bank where he should cash his credit. And though there were doubtless many other places, who should say in which of them it was not ambushed? No, he could not tell where he was to go. He must not lose time on these insolubilities. Let him go back to the beginning. It was plain he must stay no longer where he was. It was plain, too, that he must not flee as he was, for he could not carry his portmanteau, and to flee and leave it was to plunge deeper in the mire. He must go, leave the house unguarded, find a cab, and return after an absence. Had he courage for that? And just then he spied a stain about a hand's breadth on his trouser leg, and reached his finger down to touch it. The finger was stained red, it was blood. He stared upon it with disgust, and awe and terror, and in the sharpness of the new sensation, fell instantly to act. He cleansed his finger in the snow, returned into the house, drew near with hushed footsteps to the dining-room door, and shut and locked it. Then he breathed a little freer, for here at least was an oaken barrier between himself and what he feared. Next he hastened to his room, tore off the spotted trousers which seemed in his eyes a link to bind him to the gallows, flung them in a corner, donned another pair, breathlessly crammed his night things into his portmanteau, locked it, swung it with an effort from the ground, and with a rush of relief, came forth again under the open heavens. The portmanteau, being of occidental build, was no feather weight. It had distressed the powerful Alan, and as for John, he was crushed under its bulk, and the sweat broke upon him thickly. Twice he must set it down to rest before he reached the gate, and when he had come so far, he must do as Alan did, and take his seat upon one corner. Here then he sat a while and panted, but now his thoughts were sensibly lightened, now with the trunk standing just inside the door. Some part of his dissociation from the house of crime had been effected, and the cabman need not pass the garden wall. It was wonderful how that relieved him, for the house, in his eyes, was a place to strike the most cursory beholder with suspicion, as though the very windows had cried murder. But there was to be no remission of the strokes of fate. As he thus sat, taking breath in the shadow of the wall, and hopped about by sparrows, it chanced that his eye roved to the fastening of the door, and what he saw plucked him to his feet, the thing locked with a spring. Once the door was closed, the bolt shut of itself, and without a key, there was no means of entering from without. He saw himself obliged to one of two distasteful and perilous alternatives, either to shut the door altogether and set his portmanteau out upon the wayside, a wonder to all beholders, or to leave the door ajar, so that any thievish tramp or holiday schoolboy might stray in and stumble on the grisly secret. To the last, as the least desperate, his mind inclined, but he must first ensure himself that he was unobserved. He peered out, and down the long road. It lay dead empty. He went to the corner of the by-road that comes by way of Dean. There also not a passenger was stirring. Plainly it was, now or never, the high tide of his affairs, and he drew the door as close as he durst, slipped a pebble in the chink, and made off downhill to find a cab. Halfway down a gate opened, and a troop of Christmas children sallied forth in the most cheerful humour, followed more soberly by a smiling mother. And this is Christmas Day, thought John, and could have laughed aloud in tragic bitterness of heart.